"Mr. Callahan, let me ask you again," the judge said, dragging out every syllable with a tone meant to humiliate. "Do you find these proceedings amusing, or are you simply too old to grasp the seriousness of your situation?" The words echoed through the small courtroom, bouncing off wood-paneled walls polished to a dull shine. For a moment, the only sound was the lazy whir of the ceiling fan. Then silence again, thick, heavy, expectant. At the defendant's table, Robert Callahan, 82 years old, did not flinch. He sat with his back perfectly straight, a posture that belonged to a younger man, perhaps one who had spent a lifetime being trained never to slouch. His cardigan was faded at the elbows, his shoes scuffed from years of wear. To most, he looked like any other elderly farmer or mechanic from the edge of town. But there was a steadiness to him, a kind of iron beneath the wrinkles that unsettled anyone who looked too long. He didn't look at Judge Harlan Pierce, who towered above him from the bench with his black robe draped like armor. Instead, Robert's pale gray eyes were fixed on the great seal of the state mounted on the wall behind the judge's chair. The expression on his face was unreadable, not fear, not even defiance. Just silence, calm and impenetrable, as though he was listening to something far away. At his side, Public Defender Ethan Ward shifted nervously. The young lawyer couldn't have been more than 30. His suit was slightly too big, his tie crooked. He had been assigned to Callahan only a week earlier, and though he had tried his best to prepare, there was something about his client's quiet, immovable presence that both inspired and terrified him. Ethan leaned forward, clearing his throat. "Your Honor, my client understands completely," he said, his voice quivering with effort. Judge Pierce cut him off with a wave of his hand. "Does he? From where I sit, I see a man showing nothing but contempt for this court, for the law itself. A traffic citation, Mr. Callahan. Failure to yield. And yet here we are, wasting taxpayers' money because you insist on dragging this to trial." A ripple of murmurs moved through the handful of spectators sitting in the wooden pews. To them, this seemed like a ridiculous spectacle. An old man refusing to pay a small fine. A stubbornness blown out of proportion. But Robert Callahan's silence carried weight, a gravity none of them could quite explain. The truth was far less petty than it appeared. On the day of the alleged violation, Robert had been driving his battered pickup home from a VA appointment. A teenager in a flashy sports car had swerved recklessly, nearly pushing Robert into a ditch. The responding officer, however, was a friend of the boy's father. The ticket had been written not to the teenager, but to Robert. It was the kind of small-town injustice that passed unnoticed every day. But Robert Callahan was not the sort of man to lie, not even to make life easier. For him, truth was not negotiable. Admitting guilt to something he hadn't done would be a stain on his honor, a betrayal of the quiet code he had lived by for decades. And so here he sat, refusing to bend. Judge Pierce leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "Look at me when I'm speaking to you," he snapped. The silence stretched. Robert did not move. The judge's lips curled into a smile. He thought he had found weakness. He mistook dignity for defiance, calm for arrogance, and so he raised his voice, making a performance for the gallery. "Men like this believe their age grants them privilege," Pierce declared. "They believe they can pick and choose which laws to obey." He let the words hang before driving them deeper. "It is cowardice, plain and simple." A quiet gasp escaped from the back row. Ethan Ward clenched his jaw, but Robert Callahan remained perfectly still, the storm breaking over him without leaving a single mark. The courtroom had become a battlefield, though only one side seemed to understand it. Judge Harlan Pierce leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, a satisfied smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. He had delivered his blow, the word cowardice hanging in the air like smoke. To him, it was the end of the matter. No man, especially not a frail old one, could remain unmoved by that insult. Yet Robert Callahan sat as though carved from stone. The silence was unbearable. Finally, Pierce slammed his gavel down. Answer the charge, Mr. Callahan. Do you deny that you disrespected the law, or will you continue this circus? Still nothing. Ethan Ward swallowed hard, tugging at his tie. He had seen stubborn defendants before, but there was something different about this silence. It wasn't confusion, nor was it arrogance. It was deliberate, as if Robert knew that every word spoken would only cheapen the truth he carried within. The judge misread it entirely. "This is unbecoming," Pierce thundered, his voice bouncing off the walls. "A man who claims to have worn a uniform yet shows no discipline, no respect. Perhaps your service was pushing papers behind a desk, or peeling potatoes in some forgotten mess hall. Is that it, Mr. Callahan? Is that the grand story you hide behind?" Ethan flinched at the words. They weren't just cruel, they were dangerous. He glanced at his client, waiting for a reaction, a flicker of anger, anything. But Robert remained composed. Only his right hand moved, almost imperceptibly, his thumb rubbing against the inside of his wrist just below the cuff of his sleeve. Ethan's eyes followed the motion, remembering something he had glimpsed once during their brief preparation. A faded tattoo, blurred by time. It looked like a skull with wings. Or maybe a ghost. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He had seen something like it years ago, during his short stint in the JAG Corps overseas. He remembered hushed stories among enlisted men, myths about a clandestine group, call signs that carried weight beyond medals. Spectre. The thought gnawed at him. Could it be possible? Could this frail, quiet man sitting at his side be connected to that legend? The judge was still railing. "Men like you think the world owes you gratitude. You call yourselves patriots, but you shirk basic civic responsibility. That, sir, is cowardice." The word struck like a match on dry kindling. The gallery stirred uneasily. For some, it was simply the harshness of the insult. For others, veterans among them, it was sacrilege. Ethan's jaw clenched so tightly a muscle jumped in his cheek. He could not allow this to go on. Beneath the table, shielding his movements with a legal pad, he slipped his phone out. His fingers flew across the screen as he typed a desperate message. "Urgent. Need confirmation. Santa Maria Superior Court. Courtroom 3. Client, Robert Callahan. Elderly vet. Judge mocking him, calling him coward. He has a faded wrist tattoo, looks like a skull with wings. Could be Spectre emblem. Please, for God's sake, run the name. Something isn't right." He hit send. The message flashed away to an old contact, Master Sergeant Lucas Hayes, a man he trusted with his life. Ethan shoved the phone back in his pocket, his pulse hammering. It was a long shot, a whisper against a hurricane. But whispers, he knew, sometimes sparked avalanches. Judge Pierce's voice pulled him back. "You see, ladies and gentlemen," the judge said, now performing for the spectators, "this is what entitlement looks like. An old man refusing accountability, clinging to outdated notions of honor. It disgusts me." Ethan opened his mouth to object, but Robert's steady gaze stopped him. It was as though the old man was saying, "Not yet." And then, just for a heartbeat, Robert wasn't in the courtroom anymore. The sterile scent of polish and old paper dissolved. In its place came the suffocating humidity of a jungle night. The whir of ceiling fans became the pounding thrum of rotor blades. He was strapped into a jump seat, headset pressed against his ear, listening to the strained breathing of soldiers pinned down far below. The radio crackled with desperate voices, men depending on him, on his voice, on his call sign. The tattoo on his wrist had once burned black and sharp, a mark of promise made in the dark. The vision flickered and was gone. Robert blinked, finding himself once again under the fluorescent lights of Courtroom 3. Judge Pierce was smiling, thinking he had broken him. "Nothing to say? I thought not." Ethan's heart pounded. His phone buzzed in his pocket, faint but insistent. He knew it was the reply. He dared not check it openly, but the vibration told him enough. The stone had been thrown into the water. Now waves would come. The courtroom was balanced on the edge of something unseen, and no one except Robert Callahan seemed prepared for the storm about to break. At Vandenberg Air Force Base, an hour north of Santa Maria, Master Sergeant Lucas Hayes had just finished sorting a stack of logistics reports when his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and saw the name Ethan Ward. He nearly ignored it, assuming it was another late-night question about veterans' benefits. But the urgency in the preview text stopped him cold. He opened the message, scanning line after line, his casual posture evaporating. By the time his eyes reached the word Spectre emblem, Hayes was on his feet, the chair clattering against the wall behind him. He sprinted down the corridor, startling young airmen who had never seen him move so fast. He didn't stop until he burst into the office of Colonel Marcus Hale, the commanding officer. "Sir," Hayes blurted out, breathless, "we have a ghost protocol situation." Colonel Hale's eyes, usually calm and measured, snapped to sharp focus. "Explain." Hayes shoved the phone forward. A civilian court in Santa Maria. An elderly man named Robert Callahan. The judge is mocking him, calling him a coward. Ethan says he has the Spectre tattoo. The colonel's face drained of color. He moved to a secure terminal and began typing furiously. The system hesitated for a heartbeat, then unlocked a file marked with crimson lettering. Classified. Eyes only. Ghost protocol active. One name glowed on the screen. Callahan. Robert J. Call sign. Spectre 1. Hale whispered the words as if afraid to disturb a ghost. My God, he's alive. Within minutes, alarms were triggered, not the blaring sirens of emergency drills, but discrete signals that set a very different machine in motion. Orders flew through encrypted channels. A transport detail was scrambled. 2 Air Force Security Forces airmen pressed into full-dress blues, and a convoy prepared to roll. At the Pentagon, word spread like wildfire. Generals who had not spoken the name in decades straightened in their chairs, voices taut with disbelief. Spectre 1 was a legend whispered in halls where classified stories lived and died. To hear he was sitting in a county courthouse treated like a criminal was unthinkable. Back in Courtroom 3, Judge Pierce continued his tirade, completely unaware of the storm rushing toward him. His voice grew louder, reveling in his imagined dominance. "Since you refuse to answer, Mr. Callahan, I will interpret your silence as contempt. It seems clear you no longer possess the faculties to respect this court or its laws." He paused, his grin stretching thin. "Therefore, I intend to remand you for psychiatric evaluation. Perhaps a hospital ward will remind you that rules apply to all of us, even stubborn old men." Ethan shot to his feet. "Your Honor, that's a gross overreach." "Sit down, Mr. Ward, or I'll hold you in contempt as well," Pierce barked. The bailiff shuffled forward, placing a reluctant hand on Robert's shoulder. "Come on, sir," he said softly, almost apologetically. "Let's not make this harder." For the first time that morning, Robert moved. He turned his head slowly, fixing the bailiff with pale eyes that seemed to pierce through flesh and bone. The younger man recoiled slightly, as if he had touched a live wire. There was something in that gaze, something ancient, unyielding that unsettled him to his core. And then it happened. The heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom opened not with a crash, but with a deliberate, powerful stillness. Every head turned. 2 security forces airmen stepped inside, their uniforms immaculate, their presence radiating discipline. One took position at the door. The other began a slow, steady walk down the center aisle. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Even Judge Pierce faltered, his gavel hovering uselessly in his hand. Behind the airman came a man whose very presence shifted the air in the room. Late 50s, his salt and pepper hair cropped close, his dress blues heavy with ribbons and medals. On his shoulders gleamed 4 silver stars. General Adrian Crane. The sound of his polished shoes echoed against the marble floor as he strode forward, his eyes locked not on the judge, not on the jury, but on Robert Callahan. Ethan's breath caught. He felt his chest tighten, knowing instinctively that the cavalry had arrived. General Crane reached the defense table and stopped, his posture snapping to perfection. For a heartbeat, the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Then, in a motion so crisp it seemed to cut the air, he raised his hand in salute. "Colonel Callahan," the general's voice boomed, deep with reverence. "Spectre 1. Sir, it is an honor to see you again." A shockwave rolled through the room. Spectators gasped, some rising to their feet instinctively. Ethan felt tears prick his eyes. The bailiff froze in place, his hand retreating from Robert's shoulder as if burned. Robert Callahan rose slowly, deliberately. His movements were steady despite his age. He met the general's gaze, and for the first time, he spoke. His voice was quiet, but it carried across the silent room. "General." That single word landed with more force than all of Judge Pierce's tirades combined. Pierce's face turned crimson. "What is the meaning of this? This is my courtroom. You have no authority here." General Crane turned his head, and the look he leveled at the judge froze him mid-sentence. The room felt colder, sharper. "You will be silent," the general said in a voice like steel. "Or I will have my men silence you." He pivoted back to face the bench, addressing the entire courtroom. "For the record, and for this court, let it be known who you are in the presence of. This man is Colonel Robert J. Callahan, United States Air Force, retired. The man you just called a coward is the recipient of the Air Force Cross, the Silver Star, the Distinguished Flying Cross, and the Medal of Honor. He is Spectre 1, a legend whose service saved countless lives in battles most of you will never even read about." The gallery erupted in whispers, shock, and awe. Ethan felt a shiver race down his spine. Robert Callahan stood quietly, his eyes lowered, as though the weight of those words was not glory, but burden. And in that moment, the battle for truth in Courtroom 3 shifted completely. The silence that followed General Crane's words was absolute. It pressed down on the courtroom, heavier than the gavel that had once commanded it. Every spectator, every clerk, even the bailiff stood frozen, their eyes fixed on the frail old man who now seemed to radiate a quiet, immovable gravity. Judge Harlan Pierce sat back, his face ashen. His earlier arrogance drained away, leaving only the pale outline of a small man who had mistaken authority for power. This is absurd," he stammered, trying to muster his voice. "You can't just walk into my courtroom." Crane turned toward him, eyes like polished steel. "Enough." The word landed with the weight of a verdict. "You've spent the morning mocking a man whose courage eclipses anything you will ever understand." Colonel Callahan's silence was not contempt. It was dignity. It was restraint. And you dared call it cowardice. Pierce's lips moved, but no sound came out. The general continued, his voice ringing across the chamber. "This man flew more than 200 missions in the most hostile skies on Earth. He carried men out of places no one else would go. On one mission, with his aircraft burning and his arm broken, he refused extraction until every one of 84 soldiers was safe. He bled for this country. He buried his brothers. And he bore the weight of those memories in silence, because true valor does not advertise itself." A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. Several veterans in the pews stood, their hands trembling as they raised them in salute. Others placed palms over their hearts. Tears glistened in more than one pair of eyes. Robert Callahan remained still, his gaze lowered. The ribbons, the medals, the titles, none of them seemed to belong to him in that moment. They belonged to the fallen, and he carried them only because they could not. General Crane took a step closer, his voice lowering but losing none of its power. "And you," he said, staring at Judge Pierce, "dared to strip him of respect. You dared to wield your robe as a weapon of humiliation. It will not stand. Not today. Not ever." The judge wilted under the weight of those words. His gavel, once a symbol of authority, sat useless on the bench. For the first time since he had taken the bench years ago, Pierce looked truly afraid. The bailiff, his hand still hovering uncertainly, stepped back from Robert altogether. His eyes shone with shame, though he had only followed orders. Ethan Ward exhaled slowly, relief and awe flooding through him. And then Robert Callahan spoke. His voice was soft, yet it seemed to echo louder than Crane's thunder. "Respect," he said, looking directly at the judge, "isn't stitched into a robe or pinned onto a chest. It's earned every day by how you treat people when no one is watching. Courage isn't about shouting. Most of the time, it's about being quiet, about doing the right thing when it costs you." The words rolled through the courtroom, touching every soul present. Crane's face softened. He placed a steady hand on Robert's back. "Let's go home, Colonel." As Robert rose, the gallery rose with him, first a few, then all, until every spectator was on their feet in silent tribute. Veterans saluted. Civilians stood, with hands to hearts. It was not commanded. It was instinct. Reverence. Judge Pierce sat frozen, a lone man at a bench that suddenly looked more like a prison. His authority was shattered, stripped not by argument, but by truth. And with that, Robert Callahan, escorted by General Crane and 2 airmen in dress blues, walked out of Courtroom 3, not as a defendant, but as a living legend reclaimed. The convoy pulled away from the courthouse under a curtain of stunned silence. Inside, Robert Callahan sat beside General Crane, his hands folded neatly on his lap, eyes gazing out the window as if none of what had transpired belonged to him. For him, the medals, the salute, even the whispered awe in the gallery, they were not triumphs. They were burdens he had carried for decades, memories that refused to fade. The case against him was dismissed before the general's vehicle even cleared the parking lot. The judge's authority had collapsed under the weight of truth, and within days the state's Judicial Commission announced a full investigation. Harlan Pierce was suspended, forced to issue a public apology. His career, once swollen with arrogance, was effectively over. Robert, however, sought no revenge, no attention. He declined interviews, turned down offers from reporters who suddenly wanted to turn his silence into headlines. He went home. He returned to the life he had always lived, tending his small garden, meeting friends for coffee on Tuesday mornings, fixing a neighbor's tractor when asked. The world now knew his name. He preferred to be forgotten. Months later, in a small diner off the highway, a man approached his table. Dressed simply in a polo and slacks, he stood awkwardly, shifting his weight from foot to foot. Robert looked up. It was Harlan Pierce. For a long moment, neither spoke. The arrogance that once cloaked Pierce was gone, replaced by something hollow, humbled. At last, his voice cracked through the silence. "Mr. Callahan, there's nothing I can say to undo what I did, but I wanted to tell you I'm sorry." Robert studied the man's face, not as a judge, not as an enemy, but as another human being. He gave a single, slow nod. It was enough. Pierce turned and left without another word. The lesson was delivered not in rage or vengeance, but in quiet grace. Robert Callahan's story reminds us that the greatest heroes rarely stand in the spotlight. They walk among us quietly, carrying memories and scars no one sees, holding to a code of honor even when the world forgets. His defiance over a traffic ticket was never about stubbornness. It was about truth, about a promise made long ago in the mud and fire of another battlefield. Don't let them forget us. And through one silent stand in a small-town courtroom, he kept that promise.